This is our third lesson in this series. The series is called Faith Founded on Fact, and I call this lesson after the series, Faith Founded on Fact. I wanted to make mention of the fact also that our class on Revelation began this morning. We have it recorded, and so if you want to study Revelation with us, Bible class is 9:30, and it's also recorded, so you can study it there. And so ask questions, have comments. I'm happy to field what I can. But at any rate, I hope that is a profitable study for all of us. So let's think about faith founded on fact. Is it legitimate for Christians to seek to establish the facticity of Christianity, death, burial, and resurrection of Christ to non-believers? Is that a legitimate pursuit? Is it legitimate for us to seek to establish the veracity of Christianity and the books of the New Testament? By veracity, I mean that it's alignment with the facts, the accuracy of the text. That's what we mean by veracity. Is that a legitimate pursuit that Christians need to be engaged in? Is the evidence of the New Testament and the witnesses therein, are they sufficient and are they credible enough to establish faith, to establish certainty? Can we come to Christianity and establish a faith that has certainty in it? So the key words here in our opening is simply, I want you to think about faith, evidence, proof. Can we prove Christianity? Proof, certainty, veracity. These are the words that we're going to think about this morning in this particular lesson. It so happens, however, that in the religious world today, many people go in different directions on this. And so as we begin on this, we want to look at two or three statements that are made. I want you to do some reading here. You don't go home to do it reading, but we'll have some things on the slide. And I want you to think about what is being said here, and then we'll come back and look at it and summarize some of the thoughts. So let's look at the first one. This man is Gustav Ahlin from 1948. He's a Lutheran theologian. It's kind of small print, but we'll look at it here. The certainty of Christian faith is not dependent upon the demonstrable character of divine revelation. The idea that scientific studies and investigations should provide a solid foundation for faith and give it certainty is contrary to the nature of both science and faith. If this were indeed possible, it would mean that science, within the empirical reality, which is the object of its study, could discover something of that revelation of which faith speaks. The discoveries of science would, in that case, verify faith. But this would obviously be to ask something of science which it cannot give without ceasing to be scientific. Whether it be a question of scientific investigation or nature or history, which a study cannot penetrate to that which is decisive for faith, the revelation of God. All right, let's think about, in summary, what perhaps we might boil it down to here, and that is looking at the lines that are underlined, and that is simply to say that faith is beyond, that is, what establishes our faith is beyond historical or scientific investigation. It has nothing to do with drawing conclusions warranted by evidence. That kind of study is really out of bounds. We're not interested in proving Christianity. And so he says all of those things, faith is separated from all these things of knowledge and science and so forth. So that's Gustav Ahlin, Lutheran theologian of yesteryear. Now here's another one. This is from Theodore Muller, same year. He is another Lutheran theologian, and I want you to listen to his statement. Christian theology is the ability to exhibit, to preach the gospel, but not to prove it true by human arguments or reason or philosophy. As the Christian theologian proclaims the truth, he wins souls for Christ, but not as he endeavors to prove true the mysteries of faith by principles of human reason. This is also the meaning of the axiom, the best apology of the Christian religion is its proclamation. Let the gospel be made known, and it will of itself prove its divine character. Christian apologetics has therefore only one function. It is to show the unreasonableness of unbelief. Never can it demonstrate the truth with enticing words of man's wisdom. So basically, what has Muller told us here in this statement? He tells us basically the same thing, does he not? That Christianity, the facts of Christianity, and it doesn't refer to them as facts, but the ideas of Christianity, that which establishes faith, is beyond proof. We can't go around proving these things. And so faith is in a realm that has nothing to do with scientific or logical investigation. We're not drawing conclusions warranted by evidence, and he makes it pretty plain here. He said that we're not interested in using argumentation to show the facts of Christianity. Now, I want to ask this question. What is the difference in what we just read here from the man named Muller and the one from Gustav Allen that we read first? Is there any difference at all, really, in substance of what they have said? No, not really. They both have agreed on one position, and that is Christianity, that is what we know in the New Testament, death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and the truths of Christianity cannot be proven. They're beyond proof. We don't want to use human reason in it. Now, here's the catch. The first man, Gustav Allen, was a theological liberal. He did not believe in the inspiration of the Bible at all. He believed it was a book concocted by uninspired men. Interestingly, Theodore Muller is one who believed in the inspiration of the text, even the verbal inspiration of the text. But in spite of that, their positions come out exactly the same way. Isn't that remarkable that you have an unbeliever in the inspiration of the text and one who believes in the inspiration of the text, both of them agreeing on a position saying Christianity is not a provable proposition. You can't establish these things by argumentation, period. Now, that may be okay. Those are Lutheran theologians from yesteryear. But I, through my years of preaching, I've collected statements. I've quit collecting them because they're so numerous, but I only want to put a couple of them on the screen for you that are stated by our brethren. And these are statements made in books that usually refer to or come out of books that refer to Christian evidences. How are we going to study the Bible and show Christian evidences? And if I would call the names, you would know who they were. So these are books of Christian evidences. One of them is a professor where it was did graduate work in Harding Graduate School in Memphis, and this is one of his statements. So these statements are so numerous, and I want you to get the flavor of them. These are very short. They tell us faith is a gamble. In those situations where it is not possible to know complete, absolute truth, in those situations which involve faith, better to take the path of hope than the path of fear. After all, what have we to lose? Faith and hope are more reasonable choices. So what is faith? It's a gamble. We're just going to jump out there, going to take the idea of faith because can't prove anything here. Is there anything in essence different here than what we've read earlier? Not really. It's all just a gamble. Everything's a leap into the dark. Everything's drawing a conclusion for which there's really no evidence. It might be more reasonable, but, we can't establish with certainty anything here. Now, that's the idea. Listen to this one. Certainly, his challenge, that's speaking about Christ, he has challenged to us, is not a blind bet. There are too many things, especially in his life, which give credence to his claims. It stands to reason, based on odds, that one will want to bet on him. That is, you're going to bet on Christ. It's still a gamble, but I've placed my bet. Now it's your turn. Now, these statements can be multiplied ad infinitum. I've seen them in bulletins. I've seen them in books regarding Christian evidences. I've taken notes of them in schools from the professorships. And this is exactly how faith is presented today by Christian people. And in the pulpits, the preachers that are trained in these schools are sitting there taking this material in and they're repeating it in the pulpits. Now, this is exactly how faith is to be conceived. It's a gamble. And there is really no difference in this and the statements that were made earlier. But basically, it's a position of agnosticism. You can't know anything. You can't really know the truth. We can only just kind of approximate to the truth, and we can't really know it at all. So in that context, I was reading this book just the other day. It was about 2 weeks ago, actually. And his name is Kurt Aland. He was a great Greek historian and church historian. And he made this comment. I thought, boy, you just can't beat this. And I want you to read what he has to say regarding it. And I think he actually really puts his finger in the problem here with this. This is a lengthy statement. We'll read it. But that Christianity in its context with the pagan world, and he's talking about the first 4 centuries, accepted some things cannot be denied. That is, paganism affected Christianity, and it can't be denied. And we saw that, and we see that build up in the Roman church. But in some ways, Christianity was influenced by its environment, and in some ways, it was independent from this environment. That was the case not only in the beginning, but it remains so in the later centuries and has lasted to the present day. Only the order has changed. Sometimes, now get this, Christianity goes ahead and drags the tenor of the time behind itself. So sometimes Christianity takes the lead. And he's speaking about in the Middle Ages. Sometimes the tenor of the time predominates and pulls Christianity after it. In the Middle Ages, Christianity took the lead. But in the modern age, it lags behind. Christianity lags behind the philosophical principles. In other words, philosophers are the ones who dominate the thought processes that even Christians go through today. And he says, so we lag behind in the modern age, even in our theological schools, in which many people today see the epitome of our theological activity. They are decisively dependent upon philosophical ways of thought and systems that come from the outside, infecting Christianity. That's what's happening. That's exactly how faith is conceived today. Certainly in the final analysis, he goes on, these stem from Christianity and cannot be conceived of without Christian preparatory work and apart from Christian thought. But they are nevertheless, what we've read earlier regarding even our brethren, are concepts that come from outside the Christian sphere. In other words, when you come to the Bible, you don't get that idea at all. That faith is a bet, that it's a gamble, that I'm going to cast my bet and now it's your turn. Or we can't really come to certitude on anything. We don't know. We can't use human reason to study the Bible. That's exactly their positions. So we're going to see in the New Testament how that is not the case. Now we can summarize all of these positions with basically 2 different things. Then I'm going to add a third to it. And that is, number one, they're telling us basically, even our brethren, that Christianity is beyond proof. Christian revelation, beyond proof. We're not interested. We can't be proving anything about it. Number 2, that we cannot use or utilize human reason. No utilizing human reason regarding Christianity. Can't use it. If you do so, then you're falling off the edge there. And then that brings us to number 3, the point that I'm adding, and that is faith comes through, and we will see, through credible testimony. And that gets to where people such as Thomas Paine, who was one of the founders of America, really one of the skeptics, and there were not many skeptics in the founding generation, but he said, once someone's an eyewitness, you can't pass it on to someone else because you're an eyewitness, they're not, so they can't know anything. So let's look at, is Christianity and the Christian truth, is it beyond proof? Number 2, can we utilize human reason? And then we'll see faith does come through credible testimony. So let's examine these 3 in order. So in each of these categories, we're only going to look at a couple of passages simply to underscore the point. So let's begin with the first, is it beyond proof? And the passage to which we turn attention is Acts 9. So let's think about Christianity, is it beyond proving? Acts 9, and this is, of course, the story of, or Paul's conversion, and after he was converted. And we'll pick up the read in Acts chapter 9 and verse 19. Remember, Paul was converted. He saw the Lord on the Damascus road. He came into the city of Damascus. Ananias came to him. He baptized him into Christ, and we read that in Acts 22:16, where Paul, in his own words, recounted what happened. Arise and be baptized, wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. So now Paul is a Christian. So we're told now, the next line, this is after the Damascus road, we're told in mid-verse 17, he says that, where Luke doing the writing, he says, he was many days with the disciples that were at Damascus. And immediately he entered into the synagogues and proclaimed Jesus, that he's the Son of God. That's amazing, isn't it? Immediately going right into the synagogues and proclaiming that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, the synagogues, of course, were those places where the Jews worshiped, and this was the synagogue, singular actually, in Damascus, the Jewish synagogue. And he proclaimed Jesus, that he is the Son of God. All that heard him, the next line says, were amazed and said, is not this he that in Jerusalem made havoc of them that called on his name? He had come here with this intent, that he might bring them bound to the chief priests. But Saul, now the next line, get this one. Saul increased the more in strength, confounding the Jews that dwelt at Damascus, proving that this is the Christ. That's a remarkable statement, isn't it? Confounded means he put them in confusion. In the synagogue, the atmosphere was that they would Q&A sessions, and they would have debates, and they'd have discussions, and rational argumentation. That's how Paul went in. And he was, in doing that, he was proving that Jesus was the Christ. How did he do that? We'll see in other passages. He did it by going to the Old Testament. Here's what the Old Testament taught. Here's how Jesus lived, and he was the fulfillment of those prophecies. But the interesting and the important fact here is that it tells us in so many words, proving that this is the Christ. There is not one singular passage in the Old Testament that said Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God. Not one. How did he do it? He brought facts together and put them together in their minds and brought them together in his presentation. That's how he did it. And that's what the word means, proving, sum bibadzo, bringing together facts and lining them up. Here's what the facts are from the Old Testament prophecies, proving that this is the Christ. Christianity, the revelation beyond proof. Amazing that people would think that way in spite of the plain evidence of the texts. Now, going on, we are told in the next line, inform this, that the Jews took counsel together to kill him. Now, how powerful was his preaching? Well, I'm going to stop and think about that. How did he press his claims, or the claims of Christ? How did he press them? Well, so much so that they wanted to kill him. Do you suppose for just one moment that Paul went in there with, well, I placed my bets, now you can place yours. Faith is a gamble. I'm gambling on Christ. You can gamble how you want to gamble. You don't get that sense at all. They wanted to kill him. But their plot became known to Saul. They watched the gates also day and night that they might kill him. His disciples took him by night, led him down through the wall, lowering him in a basket. So Paul leaves Damascus. Then the next line tells us he comes to Jerusalem, and he essayed, that means, this is ASV or King James language, means he wanted to be identified with the disciples there. Came to Jerusalem. And remember, he had been in Jerusalem. He had persecuted Christians in Jerusalem. So he essayed to join himself to the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. Aren't you thankful for the next man that you read about here? What a great man is this. If we didn't have this man, we wouldn't have Paul. But Barnabas took him, brought him to the apostles, declared unto them how he had seen the Lord in the way, he had spoken unto them, and how he had preached boldly in the name of Jesus at Damascus. And then we're told he was with them going in and going out at Jerusalem. That means he was moving about freely among the brethren in Jerusalem, preaching boldly in the name of the Lord. Does that sound like the kind of preaching that we've read a few moments? No. Preaching boldly in the name of the Lord. Then you have the next line, which tells us that he confuted the Jews that were there. This comes down to verse 29. He spake and disputed against the Grecian Jews, but they were seeking to kill him. Now, spake, that means proclaim the message, and disputed. What does that mean, he disputed? He debated them. He went into the synagogue and debated them, showing that Jesus was the Messiah. And so powerful was his preaching, we're going to kill this man. Now, that's the kind of preaching that was going on in the first century. That's why Christianity spread like wildfire. One other passage now. Let's just notice another man. This comes to us from Acts chapter 18. And this is verses 24 through 28. Such an interesting passage. And Luke uses words regarding this man, Apollos, even more powerful words than he does regarding Paul. So the man's name is Apollos. There was a certain Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by race, who was mighty in the Scriptures, and he came to Ephesus, mighty in the Scriptures, and he was an eloquent man. We're told an eloquent man came to Ephesus, mighty in the Scriptures. Now, let's stop here and take stock. He was an Alexandrian by race. That means there was a Jewish colony in Alexandria, Egypt. Where are we now? He's in Ephesus. He comes all the way to Asia. Paul had been in Asia. Paul is coming back here, and the next paragraph shows Paul coming to Ephesus himself. So Apollos has come to Ephesus. He's preaching in the name of the Lord, but we're told his background. He was from Alexandria. He was an eloquent man. He was a great speaker. And he was mighty in the Scriptures. Don't you just wish that we could be mighty in the Scriptures like that? What would be involved in being mighty in the Scriptures? Wow, I don't know. But I do know one thing. We don't have many of them around today, do we? Mighty in the Scriptures. Now we're told that this man had been instructed in the way of the Lord. And he preached boldly in the name of the Lord. Then we're told that he knew only the baptism of John. All right, what is John's baptism? John baptized with the baptism of repentance, saying that they would believe on him who would come after, that is, a forward-looking baptism. Baptism into Christ is looking back at the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. So it was a baptism in anticipation of, and it should be in remembrance of, or the acknowledgement of what had happened already. Backward looking. So he knew only the baptism of John, but he goes into the synagogue. Incidentally, are we people who go into, and these are denominational churches, synagogues are denominational churches. He goes in there, and they let him speak, and he stands up and he preaches the gospel of Christ. Is that how we do things? We stay in our little house. We don't go places like that. We don't go to the Jewish synagogues. We don't go to denominational churches and say, hey, let me speak. That's what he did. He goes into the denominational Jewish synagogue. I say denominational because there were Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Herodians, Zealots, all these different denominations, and they had those people there then. And he goes in there and he preaches boldly in the name of the Lord. There were two people there that heard him. They were Priscilla and Aquila. Sometimes we call them Priscilla and Aquila, but I say Priscilla and Aquila. They heard him speaking, and they took him aside and taught him the way of the Lord more exactly. That is, regarding the baptism of John. He knew only the baptism of John. They taught him more exactly the Word of God. Then we're told that he was minded to go over to Achaia. Now, where's Achaia? That's over in Europe. That's Greece. He wants to go to Greece. The church at Corinth is there in Achaia. So he's in Asia, wants to go over to Achaia. He was minded to go over to Achaia, and the brethren encouraged him. That's the next line. And they wrote letters to the brethren there. And when he was come, now he's come all the way over here to Greece. He comes to Corinth. Incidentally, we have evidence of that elsewhere in the New Testament. And remember when Paul writes to the Corinthians? He says, some of you want to claim that I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. Remember that? I'm of Cephas, and I'm of Christ. That was a problem there. Well, Apollos had gone over there. So he goes over there and he helped them much that had believed through grace. For, verse 28, now look at this. He powerfully confuted the Jews, showing by the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. Powerfully confuted. The words here are so strong that he set them on edge. He set them on their ear, showing that Jesus was the Christ. And the word showing is a Greek word, is epidiknoumi, which means he proved the proposition. He proved it to them. Christianity, Christian revelation beyond proof? No, sir. No, ma'am. Christian revelation is not beyond proof. It is a provable proposition. That's the way they preached in the first century, and perhaps the reason they grew is because they were more convicted than we are today by that kind of preaching. Let's look at the next one. The other idea that we saw in those slides earlier was you cannot utilize human reason. Can't utilize human reason. Let's look at a couple of passages. One of them, they're right here in Acts. We'll go to Acts 17, verses 1 through 3, and then we'll look at Acts chapter 19, verses 8 and 9. That will be when Paul's at Ephesus himself. Acts 17, verses 1 through 3. And this is regarding Paul. When they passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where was a synagogue of the Jews. You following? There's a synagogue of the Jews. Where's Paul going to go to preach? Right here. And he entered into the synagogue, and for 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. There is again reasoning. Opening and alleging. What does opening mean? Opening means interpreting. He interpreted the passages in the Old Testament. He gave an interpretation of them. Here's what they mean. Opening and alleging. That is, he set forward Christ and him crucified. Opening and alleging that it behooved the Christ to suffer, to rise again from the dead, and that repentance and remission should be preached in his name. And that this Jesus, whom he said, I proclaim unto you, is the Christ. Now, there are a couple of interesting facts that we need to note, too, actually. One of them is, what would be a sticking point with the Jews? The sticking point with the Jews would be a crucified Messiah. They were not about to accept a crucified Messiah. That was not their theology at all. They wanted a military warrior that would free them from Roman oppression and bring about physical warfare. They were not about a Messiah that would be crucified. So there's a sticking point with the Jews. That's why we are told in this text, he emphasized that Jesus suffered, that was behooved to Christ to suffer. That is, the Old Testament taught. He would suffer, rise again from the dead, that this Jesus whom I proclaim unto you is the Messiah. They were just, But here's something else. Can you think about perhaps what Paul could have said when he went in there? What he did not say. He did not say that I saw the Lord on the Damascus road. He spoke to me. Now, they used that, and he used that material later when he spoke before Agrippa, but he didn't do it here, did he? He had access to it, but he didn't utilize it here. Instead, he was proving it, not because I've seen the Lord, but he was going to the Old Testament to prove that Jesus was the Christ. That's how he reasoned with them. Isn't that interesting? He didn't go say, I saw the Lord. Now, if you were in modern religion, modern day churches, that would be the first and the only thing that people would bring out. Here's what I saw. Here's what I dreamed. Here's what I heard. Here's the voice I heard yesterday. And on and on and on it goes. Figment of imaginations most of the time. Paul didn't even resort to that real vision that he saw of the Lord. He went to the Old Testament to prove it. And that's the way the church fathers operated the first 4 centuries as well. Let's go to the next passage, which is chapter 19, verses 89. You'll see the same thing. At Ephesus, we are told that he goes into the synagogue again, and he reasoning and persuading the things concerning the kingdom of God. Reasoning. All right, think about number 2 here. Cannot utilize human reason. He was putting facts together in your mind. That's what the word means, putting facts together. Human reason. Cannot utilize human reason to establish the truth of Christianity? Brethren, we are so lost in the modern age regarding what establishes faith. It's absolutely astounding. But this is how Paul preached. And Apollos, as well as all the others. You can go through the book of Acts and see it. Now, what was the reaction? Looking at Acts 19, what was the reaction? Well, same type of thing. Some were hardened. Because he was there 3 months, by the way. That's a quarter of a year in the synagogue, arguing and debating, showing, reasoning that this is the Messiah. And some were hardened and disobedient. And they spoke evil of the way before the multitude. That is, they would be in the synagogue and they would be now talking evil about Paul. So we're told that Paul separated himself, withdrew the disciples into the school of Tyrannus, reasoning daily there. Reasoning daily in the school of Tyrannus. What is the school of Tyrannus? I don't know, but it was one of those schools where they had some classical education going on, and they were all there in the school, and that is the disciples, now separating from the synagogue, and he was reasoning with them consistently. So what do we have? Number one, they're proving these propositions. Number two, they're reasoning with individuals. We need to take stock of what constitutes faith. Now let's go to the last point. This one is very, very interesting. And that is, faith can come through credible testimony. Faith can come through credible testimony. Remember what I mentioned? Thomas Paine, for example, said some eyewitness can't pass on the information, and that person cannot be now. No, he can't be certain of anything. Let's see how the New Testament treats this. And we'll go to Mark chapter 16, first of all. I want to give you a moment to look at it. Mark 16, we'll look specifically at verse 14. Now in Mark 16, the scene here is the Lord has resurrected from the grave. This is the last chapter of Mark. And he has shown himself alive, as Luke will put it in Acts chapter 1, by many infallible proofs. And some of the people who had seen him, the first person who saw the resurrected Lord was who? Mary Magdalene, John chapter 20. Mary saw the Lord. Isn't that great? Mary, lowly Mary, saw the Lord. She came and told the disciples, we're told in verse 10, that she had seen the Lord, and what did they say? We don't believe it. No. Mm-mm. Then there were two other people on the road to Emmaus. Remember, Jesus had gone and appeared to them, and he had spoken to them, and he appeared to them and showed himself alive to them, and they came running back into Jerusalem. On the way to Emmaus, they said, we'll cut that trip short. They came back to Jerusalem, came to the apostolic core, and said, look, we've seen the Lord. He's resurrected from the dead. His body is out of the grave. They said, no, we don't believe it. That's verses 12 and 13. No, we don't believe it. Now, according to many people today, they're acting honorably because, unless I see it myself, I'm not going to accept it. How did our Lord behave? How did our Lord treat this unbelief? Look at verse 14. He came into the apostles, and he upbraided them, criticized them for their unbelief, because they did not accept the credible testimony of other people. It is ours, logically speaking and reasonably speaking, to accept credible testimony. And that's exactly how our Lord treats it. The last passage we want to examine is Luke 1 through 4. And the same point is made here. I told you there'd be only two passages per point here. This is the passage that was read in your hearing by Brother David a moment ago. Luke begins his gospel this way. Forasmuch as many have taken in hand to draw up a narrative concerning those matters that have been fulfilled among us, even as they delivered them unto us, who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Stop here. What did he just say? What did he say? Some of you are not looking at the text. You don't know what he said. Some of you don't know. Some of you are kind of like getting sleepy on me here. What did he say? He just said, I am not an eyewitness. I have talked to those who were eyewitnesses, but I'm not an eyewitness as I'm drawing up this account. Many have drawn up the account. They've taken in hand, they've attempted to draw up the account of the narrative of what happened among us, the life of Christ, and they were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. They delivered them to us. Is Luke an eyewitness? No, he's not. No, he's not. But he does have the accounts of the eyewitnesses. All right? Even as they delivered them unto us, who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Now, let's go down to verse 3. I think it's verse 3 is where we are. Then he tells us next, it seemed good to me also, having traced the course of all things accurately from the first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus. Now get this, that you might know the certainty of the things wherein you were instructed. Luke is going to receive it from first-hand eyewitnesses. He's going to write it down. He's going to give it to other people in the text, and he says that you might know the certainty of the things wherein you were instructed. He uses the word know, and you have certainty. Isn't that great? That's how Christianity is. That's the establishment of the faith. That's how we establish our faith. That's why we say faith founded on fact. So let us not be caught up in what is so prominent in the religious world, even in the churches of Christ, unfortunately, regarding faith being some kind of leap into the dark, drawing a conclusion for which there's no evidence, something that is guesswork, something that is a bet, hedging my bets, a gamble. Nothing like that do we read in the New Testament at all. Now, I want to conclude with a short article. And this article I found, actually my wife was reading it to me yesterday from the Epoch Times. And it involves faith, people who have reasons to believe, reasons to live. And they're talking about, actually the article is about the immunity that people have to COVID-19 and some natural immunities. And they have discovered that some people have more natural immunity to not only to that, but they would go back to the Black Plague and other diseases and plagues that have happened. And so they're comparing COVID-19 to some of those plagues. And they point out that many people have more immunities built up against those diseases and even COVID-19 than others, naturally speaking. And psychologists have weighed in on the subject, and they said, here's what's happening. And they use two words. They say there are two different areas of what are called pleasure. There's a psychologist, and they say, number one, there is what they call hedonistic or hedonic pleasure. What does hedonism mean? Hedonism is pleasure. Pleasure, and that has come to have connotations of pleasures that are unlawful pleasures, but it would mean such as I have a good meal, I enjoy that, I see a good entertainment, a good movie, I enjoy that, I'm laughing with friends, I enjoy that, all that's good, I do something that I like, I go hunting or whatever it may be, and I enjoy that. That's hedonistic pleasure. That's surface level, is what they call it, surface level pleasure. But there's another one, eudaimonia, which is more deep-seated, down at the bottom level, which really is the satisfaction that you have in life. And it is discovered that those who have a deeper satisfaction in life are those who have purpose for living and have a well-grounded faith. You have well-grounded faith, you have purpose for living, you have better handle on your emotions, you have better immunities against diseases, you have better abilities to handle the vicissitudes or the ups and downs of life. They don't affect you as dramatically and drastically as some of the people in the world who are affected so emotionally by everything going up and down and all around, because you have this what is called eudaimonia. And that's a Greek word meaning simply the pleasure of life, or the satisfaction that is at a deep, deep level. And it comes because you know your purpose for living. You know your faith. You know that it's grounded upon fact. And therefore, you can take in and you're able to absorb some of the problems in life. So it behooves us, to use the language of Luke here, it behooves us to ground our faith, to substantiate it, to build it up, to strengthen it, even for the simple things in life, such as immunity to diseases or immunities to problems, and helps us to live a more level life, a more level being. Isn't that great? That's amazing to think. And that's what psychologists are saying. So that's what faith is all about. So next week, we're going to look at walking by faith. The passage will be 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And we'll look at what is it to walk by faith. And that will be the last lesson in this particular series. The lesson is yours. If you want to respond to the invitation, you can come to the front, and we will assist you in any way that we can while we stand and sing.